Module A328. How are empires experienced? How do empires decline, end, and persist? Page 266. India, Unit 19, from the formation of the Indian National Congress in 1885 to independence and partition in 1947. The French Empire, Unit 20, in both its settler, Algeria, and occupation colony forms. And finally, United Kingdom as an imperial centre, Unit 21, asks how empire transformed it and how it dealt with and is still dealing with imperial legacies. Together, these case studies will take you from the late 18th to 21st centuries. You will need to understand each case study on its own terms, but also be able to compare and contrast them. So this information aims to help you to do both by tackling the questions. What was decolonisation and what forces combined to facilitate or retard it? Different types of decolonisation. In comparing and contrasting these units, remember Unit 3 and its varying definition of type of colony and of imperial power. The kind of colonial situation you are looking at matters if you are to ensure you'll compare apples with apples, not oranges. So you should start by being aware that decolonisation can mean distinct things and different types of process according to what is being decolonised in terms of type of colony, or indeed an entire imperial system. The object of decolonisation could be a system of power, colony, settler colony, metropolis, post-colony, for instance. John Darwin's works on decolonisation focused primarily on the weakening of Britain's global system of power. Type 1 in the above list, of which its empire was just one part. Darwin claims that between 1919 and 1939, Britain actually consolidated its power in some ways. Paradoxically, however, it did so by granting formal independence to some colonial territories. Type 2 in the list above, notably Egypt 1922 and Iraq 1932. By establishing treaties and base agreements with them, Britain retained what its system of power needed, but with less aggravation and cost. While there was arguably no decline in power for Britain, from the perspective of Iraq and Britain, there had been a major, if incomplete, process of decolonisation. For Type 2 colony, decolonisation is a long-term process of gaining autonomy, on which the independence agreement and ceremony are just one stage. Keep such distinctions in mind throughout this block. For instance, Unit 19 on the Middle East covers both Iraqi nationalism and Britain's attempts to keep military bases and businesses in the Middle East in order to maintain its system of power after Iraq's formal independence. Unit 17 on the Ottoman Empire also requires you to think both in terms of the varying fortunes of the Ottoman system of power and of the demands of emerging nations. First, let's consider decline and eventual end of the Ottoman system of power as one form of decolonisation. If, for instance, you focus on the empire's size, population, internal unity, and physical military strength relative to its major competitors, you'll see distinct pulses, that is, periods of major losses distributed across several centuries. If, by contrast, you focus more on its survival as an empire and its continuing appetite for empire, the end seems to come more suddenly. Between 1914 and 1923, that accelerated pace of events in turn raises questions about the role of catalysts such as war, about changing metropolitan willpower, and about key decisions. Second, let's shift focus and look at the decolonisation as a struggle for autonomy by various Ottoman territories such as Greece and Armenia. This understanding of decolonisation raises distinct types of question. about the growth of unifying subject imaginaries, nationalism, and about how subject capacity to challenge and defeat imperial power increased. Indeed, it is worth looking at the whole issue of nationalism in more detail. Nationalism and subject imaginaries. I now want to switch to Gandhi and the Indian National Congress, which is discussed at greater length in U19, in order to consider colonial nationalism in more detail. The INC provides us with an example of a longer term process of decolonisation and of the range of repertories of action or resistance that nationalists could employ. The INC initially petitioned their British rulers to ask for more reform. However, when hopes of an accelerated move towards Dominion status, full internal government of the type enjoyed by the likes of Australia, was frustrated after 1918, Gandhi encouraged self-strengthening, self-reliance and civil disobedience. He argued that it was Indians who allowed the British to rule and that, if they withdrew cooperation, they could force concessions. As we'll see in Unit 19, Gandhi developed a repertory of actions and concepts such as ahimsa, avoidance of harm to others, non-violent action and self-force against injustice, Swadeshi, self-reliance, including boycotts of British cotton goods, Swarajya, self-rule and in transformation as freedom beyond independence alone, and civil disobedience. We can see just how distinctive Gandhi's preferred reporture of actions was if we contrast it with that of Frantz Fanon, who came from the French colony of Martinique in the Caribbean. Fanon sided with the Algerians in their war against the French of 1954 to 62. He emphasised the need to purge actual and physiological subordination of the colonised through violent overthrow of the coloniser. Then again, some nationalists found another way. For instance, Unit 3 showed the relatively rare example of the colonial territory assimilating to the metropole. In 1946, the Caribbean island of the Martinique became a department of France. Its inhabitants retained the French link while having enough local control to furnish their distinctive sense of Creolite or blended identity. So each subject, people had to forge its own positive identity and its own reporture of actions for forcing the colonial power to make concessions. Another way of putting this is that we are already talking about colonial nationalism in two separate but linked senses. Positive nationalism describes how the subject imaginary or imagination emerges from the sharing of events, symbols, and beliefs. This can be facilitated by, for example, elite action, the availability of widely read newspapers and shared curricula. Negative nationalism describes the portraits and action available to force concessions and a degree of unity of purpose and connections to a mass base that leaders can muster. As we read the units in the block, we can see we should be on the lookout for examples of key concepts, subject imaginaries, and reporters of action. You should also recall that we discussed the more positive conception of nationalism in Unit 3, Section 5 and 6. There we stress how subject imaginaries of what Benedict Anderson termed an imaginary community could emerge via, for example, a colonial education system using a single lingua franca, a local language press, and the evocation of common history, events, and symbols. These could help develop secondary nationalism, which unites different groups, in contrast with primary nationalism, which is loyalty and pre-colonial authorities. Remember, though, that the very act of constructing such a nation could be contested, involving contempting and contrasting imagined decolonisation. Hence, some Algerian harkists were just collecting a salary, but others were loyal to France. In Aden, multiple imagined decolonisation by contrasting socialist and tribal groups. contributed to the chaos of late decolonisation and of the British withdrawal in 1967. So, you should also be on the lookout for competing imagined decolonisation and the way they shaped events. Solvents and glues of empire. Decolonisation, in the sense of imagining a new autonomous state and society, provided one powerful solvent of empire. However, lurches forward in terms of colonial rights and autonomy often come courtesy of a different solvent. War, an earlier era of decolonisation from 1783 to 1920s in the Americas, had been driven by war. The United States won its freedom in 1783, partly thanks to the French and Spanish help. Then the Napoleonic Wars, 1802 to 15, helped to loosen Spain's grip on its mainland American territories. As we'll see, wars also contributed to the decolonisation of India and to the end of the Ottoman Empire. Darwin has thus argued that war was often a catalyst and that eras of decolonisation could emerge from a combination of war's impact, demonstration effects, and the emergence of new international norms. Darwin, 1999. For the 1780s to 1820s era of decolonisation, for instance, for the revolutionary ideas of the French and American revolutions were gaining international currency for post-1918. It was the idea of a right of national self-determination, put forward by President Woodrow Wilson to underpin American entry for the First World War. This notion was then embodied in post-war treaties and the League of Nations, the post-1945. We have the influence of a bipolar world, with the United States and the Soviet Union competing to appear anti-imperial, and then the United Nations General Assembly also becoming anti-colonial as newly independent states were admitted, especially from 1960 onwards. Bringing this together, Darwin has argued that we can divide the major solvents of empire into three types, namely metropolitan, for instance, changing attitudes to empire, changing power and population relative to colonies, and key decisions concerning colonies and empire as a whole. Peripheral in the colonies, for instance, growth of positive and negative nationalism, both in the short and long term, and their repertories of action and key concepts. International, for instance, the change in relative power of the metropolis owing to the impact of major wars and conflicts. New set of norms that groups can use to assert their right of self-determination, and the influence of new institutions such as United Nations. How these three interacted, ricocheted of each other, play a key role in creating and shaping decolonisation. Beyond that, however, even in the areas of decolonisation, some systems of power are more resilient than others. What countervailing glues help to keep empires going? Even under extreme stress, we have already noted how ideas of assimilation were at work in some colonies and among some groups in the late French Empire. Additionally, what forces helped the British system of power to survive more than one wave of decolonisation? It grew again after the loss of the American colonies, allowing the settler colonies more autonomy. It survived the 1940s to 50s era by converting from an authoritarian empire into the Commonwealth. Was it luck or sheer fiscal military power that allowed Britain's system of power service of a catalytism of global wars, albeit their attenuated form, in a way that Ottoman Empire, for example, could not? You will touch on this question in Unit 19, or Unit 20 will examine the formal decolonisation. Colonising post-colonialism, but did not decolonisation end with formal independence? To see why this is often not the case, let's start by looking at what happened in settler colonies. Unit 13 showed how Australia stepped towards reconciliation with its first peoples come along after Britain acknowledged Australian self-government. Such formal steps in no way removed issues of decolonisation. in the sense of addressing the impact of imperialism on First Nations. This example of a post-colonial legacy that authors like Lindu Tahiri Smith, who is of Ngati Awa and Ngati Poru Maori heritage, argue requires ongoing decolonisation, that is, a form of decolonisation in response to post-colonial issues. Unit 13, Section 5 and Unit 12 touch on other post-colonial issues. To what extent does dealing with legacies of colonialism, monuments, ideas, languages, inequities and economic and environmental impact continue to be an issue into the independence era? Many scholars and groups claim decolonisation is incomplete, for instance. Smith was decolonising method, method, uh, methodologies, whilst decolonisation, once viewed as a formal process of handing over the instruments of government, is now recognised by a long-term process involving the bureaucratic, cultural, linguistic and psychological divesting of colonial power. We therefore finished the module in Unit 21, which considers similar question for the United Kingdom. In what ways did the Empire leave a legacy in the United Kingdom that could be the target for decolonising, a legacy that persisted after the return of Hong Kong to China in 1997? The end of the Ottoman Empire, Unit 17. In an essay, How Empires End, American social scientist Charles Tilly provides a model to explain how the end of empires. Empires can collapse spectacularly. Ruin sometimes rushes in because the empire's dominated polities remain detachable by virtue of weak intuition and administrative web their viceroys enjoy. Autonomy's power, including the power to defect, subjugate, population retain distinct identities, memories and grievances, and information indicating that the centre has become bumble spreads fast among dominated units and external enemies. This unit explores these points by studying how internal and external pressures weaken the Ottoman Empire system of power, undermining its internal cohesion and causing its decline and ultimate collapse. Several of the factors that Tilly highlights are evident in the demise of the Ottoman Empire. The diversity of the empire in terms of languages, religions, ethnicities, and geography made it increasingly difficult to control from the centre. Particularly, nationalist sentiments began to rise in many parts of the empire, and as local leaders demanded autonomy, loss of authority, partly because of the very reforms that were intended to strengthen it, led to harsher measures against potential internal enemies, which in turn heightened unrest in the empire. Over time, the empire also fell behind its European competitors in several areas. Education. Many Ottomans were poorly educated or non-literate. Population, where other powers increased their population during the 19th century, members in the Ottoman Empire stagnated. Economic growth dependence on farming led to poor economic growth. Harvests increasing served to pay debts to European creditors, leading to famine. Industrialization. The largely agrarian empire did not industrialize as effectively as the great powers. Its infrastructure was less developed than of its competitors, and its army was less well equipped. Wars. The empire also engaged in several successful wars that culminated in the loss of the First World War, owing to lack of heavy weaponry, munitions, and railroads. In addition to these internal pressures, external factors also contributed to the empire's decline and ultimate collapse. Ambitious European powers sought to expand their own interests and resorted to undermining the standing of Ottoman Empire at home and abroad. France and Britain, for example, coveted Ottoman territory in the Middle East, while Russia sought to increase its influence in the Balkans by supporting and encouraging nationalist uprisings. Many of the internal and external pressures were highlighted. It was not caused by wars, and wars led to the empire's ultimate end. It suffered a succession of defeats in 1912 to 1922, including the war against Italy in 1911, and two wars against Balkan powers between 1912 and 1913. In 14, the Ottomans entered the First World War on Germany's side, a costly and factual mistake. Lost World War was instrumental by precip- uh, precipitating the empire's collapse as the visitors dismembered the empire. The peace treaties of Sevres, signed in August 1920, dealt with the final blow. The defeat led to a partition of the empire territory, which was now reduced to the area of Anatolia. Figure 17.27 in section 5.3 for losses of territory after the war. The Turkish War of Independence followed and resulted in abolition of the Sultanate and the abdication of the 36th Ottoman Sultan. The empire finally ended the signing of the Treaty of Lausanne in July 1923 and the subsequent proclamation of the Republic in Turkey in 1923.